responses. Ask the same question several times during an extended negotiation to see if you get consistent answers. In our next session, I'll talk about the importance of gathering information before and during the negotiation. Second, the patience to outlast the other negotiator. Patience is a virtue to a good negotiator. I remember going around the country on a press tour to promote my book on negotiating. A couple of times I showed up at television stations and the interviewer said to me, "You don't look like a negotiator." I knew what they meant and it didn't offend me. They meant, "We thought you'd look tougher. We thought you'd look meaner." Perhaps in seeing movies about union negotiators, many people think of negotiators as tough, ruthless people who will pull any ruthless trick to trick the other side into losing. Nothing could be further from the truth. Good negotiators are very patient people who won't let time pressure bully them into making a deal that's not in everybody's best interest. Remember the Vietnam peace talks? Our negotiator, Averell Harriman, rented a suite at the Ritz Hotel in Paris on a week-to-week basis. The Vietnamese negotiator, Juan Tu, rented a villa in the countryside for 2.5 years. With your government, your people, and the world press breathing down your neck for results, it takes courage to show that much patience, but it's very effective. Third, the courage to ask for more than you expect to get. As I told you in our first session together, Henry Kissinger believes that effectiveness at the conference table depends on overstating one's demands. Apart from projecting the willingness to walk away if you can't get what you want, I don't think that there is anything more important than understanding this principle and having the courage to apply it. We all lack courage because we fear ridicule. Remember when I taught you about the bracketing gambit in session 1? I told you that your initial proposal to the buyer should be so high that it brackets your real objective. You should always advance your maximum plausible position. Sometimes that's hard to do. We simply don't have the courage to make those way-out proposals because we're afraid the buyer will laugh at us. The fear of ridicule stops us from accomplishing many things with our lives. To be a power negotiator, you must get over that fear. You must be able to comfortably advance your maximum plausible position and not apologize for it. Fourth, the integrity to press for a win-win solution. Straight Up by James Ramsey Ullman was an excellent biography of young mountain climber John Harlan, who at 30 years of age died trying to climb the Eiger Mountain directissima, straight up. The author, a famous chronicler of mountain climbing events, wrote about Harlan's life in the preface. He said, "Straight up is a way of serving a drink. It's also a way to climb a mountain and of living a life." I believe that straight up is the way to negotiate. Often the opportunity to take quick advantage of a buyer who's in trouble will tempt you. Often you'll be in a situation in which you know something that if the other knew, they wouldn't be so eager to buy from you. Having the integrity to push for a win-win solution, even when you have the other side on the ropes, is a rare and precious commodity. I don't mean by this that you make costly concessions to the other side because you're so charitable. I do mean that you continue to look for ways to make concessions to the other side that do not take away from your position. Fifth, the willingness to be a good listener. Only a good listener can be a win-win negotiator. Only a good listener can detect the other side's real needs in a negotiation. Here are some tips for being a good listener when you're with a buyer. Increase your concentration by thinking of listening as an interactive process. Lean forward. Tilt your head a little to show that you're paying attention. Ask questions. Give feedback. Mirror what the buyer said. Avoid boredom by playing mind games. Concentrate on what the buyer is saying, not the style of delivery. You can do this by picking the longest word in a sentence or rephrasing what he just said. Because you can listen 4 times faster than the speaker can speak, you need to do something or your mind will wander. Increase your comprehension of what the buyer is saying by taking notes right from the start of the conversation. Take a large pad of paper with you, head it up with the date and the topic, and start to keep brief notes of what's being said. Paper is cheaper than the time it takes to go back and get the details. This communicates to the buyer that you care about what he's saying. An additional bonus is that when the buyer sees that you're writing things down, they tend to be a lot more accurate in what they're telling you. Next, defer making judgment of the other person until he's through. If you immediately analyze someone as phony or manipulative or self-serving, you tend to shut him out and quit listening to him. So just hold off and wait until he's through before you evaluate. Improve your ability to evaluate what's being said by asking the buyer to present her conclusions first. Then if you don't agree with her completely, ask her to support her conclusions. Keep an open mind until she has. Be aware of your personal biases and be conscious of how they're coloring your reactions. If you know that you don't like attorneys, you can evaluate the information much more clearly when you're aware that this is causing you to distrust the person who's talking to you. Perhaps you're a person who can't stand people trying to hype you. You automatically resist what they have to say, whether it's right or whether it's wrong. So be aware of that. It improves your ability to evaluate what they're saying. Learn to take notes with a divided notepad, one with a line down the middle. On the left, you list the facts as they were presented. On the right, you note the evaluation of what was said. Now let's talk about the attitudes of a power negotiator. I'm going to talk about three things: the willingness to live with ambiguity, having a competitive spirit, and not having a strong need to be liked. First, the willingness to live with ambiguity. Power negotiators relish the idea of going into a negotiation not knowing whether they'll come out as heroes or if they'll come out carrying their heads in their hands. This willingness to live with ambiguity requires a particular attitude. People who like people are much more comfortable with ambiguity. People who prefer things have trouble with it. For this reason, engineers, accountants, and architects, members of those professions that depend on accuracy, have a tough time with negotiating. They don't like the push and the shove of it. They would rather have everything laid out in black and white. Let me give you a little quiz to test your willingness to live with ambiguity. Number one, if you're going to a party, do you first like to know who's likely to be there? Two, if your spouse is taking you to have dinner with friends at a restaurant, do you like to know exactly which restaurant you're going to? Three, do you like to plan out your vacations to the smallest detail? If you said yes to all three of these, you have a major problem with ambiguity. To become a better negotiator, I suggest that you force yourself to tolerate situations in which you don't know exactly what the outcome will be. Second, having a competitive spirit. Good negotiators have an intense desire to win when they're negotiating. Seeing negotiating as a game is a big part of what makes you good at it. It's fun to walk into the arena and pit your skills against the skills of the buyer. It always amazes me that salespeople can be so competitive in sports and so fearful when it comes to handling buyers. You may enjoy playing racquetball, so you set up an early morning game with a buyer. On the racquetball court, you'll do everything you can within the rules of the game to beat the buyer. Then you shower off and go to the office to negotiate the sale, and the moment the buyer mentions price, you roll over and feel that you're at the buyer's mercy. The more you think of negotiating as a game, the more competitive you'll become. The more competitive you become, the more courageous you become, and the better you'll do. Third, not having a strong need to be liked. Power negotiators are not restrained by the need to be liked. Abraham Maslow is famous for his pyramid of human needs, which showed our needs as 1. Survival, 2. Security, the need to be assured of our continued survival, 3. Social, the need to be liked by others, 4. Self-esteem, the need to be respected by others, and 5. Self-actualization, the need to feel fulfilled. Power negotiators are beyond stage 3 most of the time. They have surpassed the need to be liked. Negotiation, almost by definition, is the management of conflict, or at very least, opposing viewpoints. If you have an exaggerated need to be liked, you won't be a good negotiator because you fear conflict too much. Does this mean that good negotiators are ruthless people who win because they don't care if the buyer loses? No, not at all. It does mean that the most important thing to them is to hammer away at the problem until a solution is found with which everybody can live. Now let's talk about the beliefs of a power negotiator. There are 5 things in which top negotiators always believe. That there is always pressure on the other side. That negotiating is played by a set of rules. That the word no is only an opening negotiating position. That acting dumb is smart, and that you should concentrate on the issues. First, there is always pressure on the other side. The pressure is always on the other person to compromise in the negotiations just as much as it is on you. However, it never appears to be that way. You always think you've got the weaker hand. For example, when you're walking into a bank to apply for a business loan, you may get very intimidated. You tend to look at that big bank, you get intimidated by the glamorous surroundings, and you start thinking, why on earth would a big bank like this want to lend little old me money? You lose sight of the fact that the pressure's on the bank. This bank spends millions of dollars a year in advertising to entice you to come in for a loan. There is tremendous pressure on the bank to get those deposits out in the form of loans. Many people at that bank have jobs that are dependent on their making loans. So a good negotiator learns to mentally compensate for that fact, that we always think we have the weaker hand in the negotiations. As she strides up to that loan officer's desk, she thinks to herself, I bet that loan officer just got a royal chewing out from his boss who told him, if you can't find somebody to lend money to today, we don't even need you around here anymore. Why do you always think you've got the weaker hand when you're selling? Because you know about the pressure that's on you, but you don't know about the pressure that's on the buyer. So you always think you've got the weaker hand. But remember that the buyer is suffering the same fate. He knows about the pressure that's on him, but he doesn't know about the pressure that's on you. He's not going to tell you this, but he probably feels that you hold all the cards. Typically, each side thinks that it has the weaker hand. Don't buy into it when a buyer says to you, I've got half a dozen other guys that will do it for less money and do it just as well. Don't buy into that. Something brought the buyer to the negotiating table. The buyer has pressure on him just as much as you have it on you. The minute you believe that and learn to mentally compensate for it, you become a more powerful negotiator. The second belief that makes you a good negotiator is that negotiating is played by a set of rules, just like the game of chess. Perhaps when you heard me talk about the gambits in our first 3 sessions together, you thought, Roger, you've never met some of the buyers I have to deal with in my business. They make Attila the Hun look like Ann Landers. They're never going to fall for that kind of thing. That's fair enough, but I want you to buy a little blue sky from me until you've had a chance to try them out. Time and again, students of mine have told me, I never thought that it would work, but it did. It's amazing. The first time you flinch, nibble, or use the vice on the other person and walk out of the negotiations with $1,000 in your pocket that you didn't expect to get, you'll be a believer too. I always remember training the employees of a large savings and loan in Southern California. At a local hotel, they arranged an afternoon seminar followed by a cocktail party and a dinner. During the cocktail party, I was standing talking to the president of the savings and loan when the maitre d' from the hotel came up with 2 bottles of wine in his arms. He asked the president if he would like wine served with the dinner. When asked, he told the president that the wine cost $22.50 a bottle. The president was about to say, okay, when I said, you'll have to do better than that. The maitre d' looked irritated, and the president looked shocked. The maitre d' finally said, I tell you what, if you'll serve it for everybody, I'll give it to you for $15 a bottle. The president's face lit up, and he was about to give his okay when I said, we were thinking more like $10 a bottle, which caused the maitre d' to say, I'm not going to negotiate the price of wine with you. $13.50 is absolutely the best I can do. Remember that the president had been in the seminar that afternoon and had heard me talking about the vice gambit, but until he saw it in action, I don't think he thought that it would work. So buy some blue sky from me until you get a chance to get out there and try these gambits. As I said, you play power negotiating by a set of rules, just like the game of chess. The big difference between negotiating and chess is that with negotiating, the other side doesn't have to know the rules. The other side will respond predictably to the moves that you make. Not because of metaphysical magic, but from tens of thousands of responses over the years, we know how the other side will react. Not every time, of course, but enough of the time to make negotiating more of a science than it is an art. Let me illustrate that with this little exercise. Think of a number between 1 and 10. Multiply that number by 9. Add the 2 digits together. Take away 5. Translate that into a letter of the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, etc. Now think of a country that starts with that letter. Take the second letter of that country and think of an animal that starts with that letter. Now, raise your hand if you're thinking of an elephant in Denmark. Look around at the hands of the people watching this with you. How do I know that if you live in the Northwest, from Oregon to the Dakotas, you'll have several people in your group who are thinking of an elk in Denmark? And how do I know that you probably have one person in your group who got lost on the math and is nowhere close? It's not because I'm a genius. It's because I've done this with thousands of salespeople, and I know how predictable the responses are. It's the same way with negotiating. The other side will respond predictably to the moves that you make. Not every time, of course, but enough of the time to make negotiating more of a science than it is an art. Believe me when I tell you that negotiating is a game that is played by a set of rules. If you learn the rules well, you can play the game well. Third, the word no is simply an opening negotiating position to power negotiators. It's never a refusal. It's simply an opening negotiating position. Remember that the next time you take a proposal into a buyer and he explodes with rage and says, "Not you again. How many times do I have to tell you that I'm happy with my present supplier? I'm not going to buy anything from you today, tomorrow, next week, or ever. Get out of my office and quit wasting my time." When that happens, remember that a power negotiator doesn't take it as a refusal. I know it's close. You should only take it to be an opening negotiating position. Think to yourself, isn't that an interesting opening negotiating position? I wonder why he decided to start with that approach. Take a lesson from your children. You can say to your child, "I'm sick of hearing about this. Go to your room. I don't want to see you until morning. And if I ever hear about this again, you are grounded for a month." Does your child hear refusal? No. He thinks, isn't that an interesting opening negotiating position? The fourth belief of power negotiators is that acting dumb is smart. When you're negotiating, you're better off acting as if you know less than everybody else, not more. The dumber you act, the better off you are, unless your apparent IQ sinks to the point where you lack any credibility. There's a good reason for this. With a few rare exceptions, human beings tend to help people that they see as less intelligent or informed, rather than taking advantage of them. Of course, there are a few ruthless people out there who will try to take advantage of weak people, but most people want to compete with people they see as brighter and help people they see as less bright. So the reason for acting dumb is that it diffuses the competitive spirit of the other side. How can you fight with someone who's asking you to help them negotiate with you? How can you carry on any type of competitive banter with a person who says, "I don't know, what do you think?" Most people, when faced with this situation, feel sorry for the other person and go out of their way to help him or her. Do you remember the TV show Columbo? Peter Falk played a detective who walked around in an old raincoat and a mental fog, chewing on an old cigar butt. He constantly wore an expression that suggested that he had just misplaced something and couldn't remember what it was, let alone where he'd left it. In fact, his success was directly attributable to how smart he was by acting dumb. His demeanor was so disarming that the murderers came close to wanting him to solve his cases because he appeared to be so helpless. I act dumb by asking for the definitions of words. If the other side says to me, "Roger, there are some ambiguities in this contract," I respond with, ambiguities. You know, I've heard that word before, but I'm not quite sure what it means. Would you mind explaining it to me? Or I might say, "Do you mind going over those figures one more time? I know that you've done it a couple of times already, but for some reason I'm not getting it. Do you mind?" This makes them think, what a klutz I've got on my hands this time. In this way, I lay to rest the competitive spirit that could have made a compromise very difficult for me to accomplish. Now the other side starts fighting me and starts trying to help me. Be careful that you're not acting dumb in your area of expertise. If you sell computers, you're expected to know if they'll work or not. If you sell medical supplies, you're expected to know if your product will meet their requirements. Win-win negotiating depends on the willingness of each side to be truly empathetic to the other side's position. That's not going to happen if both sides continue to compete with each other. Power negotiators know that acting dumb diffuses that competitive spirit and opens the door to win-win solutions. The fifth belief of power negotiators is that concentrating on the issues is powerful. Power negotiators know that they should always concentrate on the issues and not be distracted by the actions of the buyer. Have you ever watched tennis on television and seen a highly emotional star like John McEnroe jumping up and down at the other end of the court, and you wonder to yourself, how on earth can anybody play tennis against somebody like that? It's such a game of concentration, it doesn't seem fair. The answer is that good tennis players understand that only one thing affects the outcome of the game of tennis. That's the movement of the ball across the net. What the other player is doing doesn't affect the outcome of the game at all as long as you know what the ball is doing. So in that way, tennis players learn to concentrate on the ball, not on the other person. When you're negotiating, the ball is the movement of the goal concessions across the negotiating table. It's the only thing that affects the outcome of the game. But it's so easy to get thrown off by what the buyer does, isn't it? I remember once wanting to buy a large real estate project in Signal Hill, California, that comprised 18 four-unit buildings. I knew that I had to get the price down far below the $1.8 million that the sellers were asking for the property, which was owned free and clear by a large group of real estate investors. A real estate agent had brought it to my attention, so I felt obligated to let him present the first offer, reserving the right to go back and negotiate directly with the sellers if he wasn't able to get my $1.2 million offer accepted. The last thing in the world the agent wanted to do was present an offer at $1.2 million, $600,000 below the asking price. But I finally convinced him to give it a try, and off he went to present the offer. By doing that, he made a tactical error. He shouldn't have gone to them. He should have had them come to him. You always have more control when you're negotiating in your power base than if you go to their power base. He came back a few hours later, and I asked him, "How did it go?" "It was awful, just awful. I'm so embarrassed," he told me. I got into this large conference room, and all of the principals had come in for the reading of the offer. They brought with them their attorney, their CPA, their real estate broker. I was planning to do the silent close on them, which is to read the offer and then be quiet. The next person who talks loses in the negotiations. The problem was there wasn't any silence. I got down to the $1.2 million, and they said, "Wait a minute, you're coming in $600,000 low. We're insulted." Then they all got up and stormed out of the room. I said, "Nothing else happened?" He said, "Well, a couple of the principals stopped in the doorway on the way out, and they said, 'We're not going to come down to a penny less than $1.5 million. It was just awful. Please don't ever ask me to present an offer that low again." I said, "Wait a minute. You mean to tell me that in 5 minutes you got them to come down $300,000 and you feel bad about the way the negotiations went?" See how easy it is to get thrown off by what the other people are doing rather than concentrating on the issues in a negotiation. It's inconceivable that a full-time professional negotiator, say an international negotiator, would walk out of negotiations because he doesn't think the other people are fair. He may walk out, but it's a specific negotiating tactic, not because he's upset. Can you imagine a top arms negotiator showing up in the White House and the president saying, "What are you doing here? I thought you were in Geneva negotiating with the Russians." "Well, yes, I was, Mr. President, but those guys are so unfair. You can't trust them, and they never keep their commitments. I just got so upset I walked out of there." Power negotiators don't do that. They concentrate on the issues, not on the personalities. You should always be thinking, where are we now compared to where we were an hour ago or yesterday or last week? Secretary of State Warren Christopher said, "It's okay to get upset when you're negotiating, as long as you're in control and you're doing it as a specific negotiating tactic. It's when you're upset and out of control that you always lose." That's why salespeople will have this happen to them. They lose an account. They take it into their sales manager and they say, "Well, we lost this one. Don't waste any time trying to save it. I did everything I could. If anybody could have saved it, I could have saved it." So the sales manager says, "Well, just as a public relations gesture, let me give the other side a call anyway." The sales manager can hold it together, not necessarily because he's any brighter or sharper than the salesperson, but because he hasn't become emotionally involved with the people the way the salesperson has. Don't do that. Learn to concentrate on the issues. So in this session, we've talked about the personal characteristics, attitudes, and beliefs of power negotiators. There really is no such thing as a born negotiator. Power negotiating is a skill that you can master. In our next session, we'll talk about two of the pressure points that always affect the outcome of the negotiation: time pressure and information power. This is Roger Dawson. Thank you for choosing to become a power negotiator. This is Roger Dawson. Welcome back to the 9th in a series of 12 programs that will turn you into a power negotiator and teach you to make more sales at higher prices than you ever thought possible. In our last session together, I taught you about the personal characteristics, attitudes, and beliefs of power negotiators. you learned that there really is no such thing as a born negotiator. Power negotiation is a skill that you can master. In this session, we'll talk about 3 pressure points that always affect the outcome of the negotiation: time pressure, information power, and walkaway power. The first pressure point is time pressure. Under time pressure, people become more flexible. Under time pressure, people make concessions that they wouldn't otherwise make. Your children know this, don't they? When does your child ask you for something? Just as you are rushing out of the house, right? When my son John was younger, I get him to drive me over to Los Angeles Airport, which is about an hour's drive from my home in La Habra Heights. We wouldn't talk about anything of consequence on the way over there. But when we were curbside and the skycap had my luggage on the cart, I'm about to race off to see if I can catch the plane, he would suddenly say, "Dad, I'm sorry, I forgot. I need $50 to fix the muffler on my car." I would say, "John, don't do this to me. I teach this stuff. How come this didn't come up before?" And he'd tell me, "I'm sorry, Dad, but I got a fix-it ticket and I have to get it fixed before you get back from your speaking tour. So please, can I have the money now? And I'll tell you about it next weekend." Children are not that manipulative, but over all those years of dealing with adults, they have learned instinctively that under time pressure, people become more flexible. The rule in negotiating is that 80% of the concessions come down in the last 20% of the time available to negotiate. If demands are presented early in the negotiation, neither side may be willing to make concessions, and the entire transaction might fall apart. If, on the other hand, additional demands or problems surface in the last 20% of the time available to negotiate, both sides are more willing to make concessions. Think of the last time that you bought a piece of real estate. It probably took about 10 weeks from the time you signed the initial contract to the time you became owner of the property. Now think of the concessions that each side made. Isn't it true that during the last 2 weeks when things came out to be renegotiated, then both sides became more flexible? Some buyers are unethical enough to use this pressure point against you. They wait until the last minute to bring up elements of the negotiation that they could have brought up earlier and resolved simply. Then, when you're getting ready to finalize the arrangements, the buyer puts these problems on the table because he or she knows that you'll be more flexible under time pressure. One thing this teaches you is that you should always tie up all the details up front. Don't leave anything to, "Oh, well, we can work that out later." Because a matter that appears to be of little importance up front can become a very big problem under time pressure. You may ask the buyer, "Will you need barcode packaging on these?" The buyer dismisses the question with a wave of his hand saying, "That's not a big problem. We can work that out later." Well, it may not be a big problem now, but it could become a big problem later when you're under time pressure to get the order shipped. Why expose yourself to that kind of problem? Tie up all the details up front. When the other side says to you, "We can work that out later," it's not going to be a big problem. Bells should start to ring. Lights should start to flash. Don't let the buyer do that to you. So when you're negotiating, you should never reveal that you have a deadline. Let's say, for example, that you sell institutional furniture and have flown to Dallas to close a sale with a hotel developer. You have a return flight from DFW at 6 o'clock. You're eager to catch that flight, but don't let the buyer know. If he does know you have a 6 o'clock flight, be sure you let him know you also have a 9 o'clock backup flight. Or for that matter, you can stay over for as long as it takes to work out a mutually satisfactory arrangement. Because if they know that you're under time pressure, they could delay the bulk of the negotiations until the last possible minute. Then there's a real danger that you'll give away things under that kind of time pressure. Here's another aspect of time pressure. The longer you can keep the other side involved in the negotiation, the more likely they are to move around to your point of view. The next time you're with a buyer and you're beginning to think that you'll never budge him, think of the tugboats in the Hudson River off Manhattan. That tiny tugboat can move that huge ocean liner around if it does it a little bit at a time. However, if the tugboat captain were to back off, rev up its engines, and try to force the ocean liner around, it wouldn't do any good. Some people negotiate like that. They reach an impasse in the negotiations that frustrates them, then they get impatient and try to force the other side to change their mind. Think of that tugboat instead. A little bit at a time, it can move the liner around. If you have enough patience, you can change anybody's mind a little bit at a time. Unfortunately, this works both ways. The longer you spend in a negotiation, the more likely you are to make concessions. You may have flown to San Francisco to negotiate a large sale. At 8 o'clock the next morning, you're in their office feeling bright, fresh, and determined to hang in and accomplish all of your goals. Unfortunately, it doesn't go as well as you hoped. The morning drags on without any progress, so you break for lunch. Then the afternoon passes, and you've only reached agreement on a few minor points. You call the airline and reschedule for the midnight red-eye flight. You break for supper and come back determined to get something done. Look out! Unless you're very careful, by 10 o'clock you'll start making concessions that you never intended to make when you started that morning. Why does it work that way? Because your subconscious mind is now screaming at you. You can't walk away from this empty-handed after all the time and effort you spent on it. You have to be able to put something together. Anytime you pass the point where you're prepared to walk away, you have set yourself up to lose in the negotiations. A power negotiator knows to disregard any time or money that he or she has invested in a project up to any given point. The time and money are gone whether you strike a deal or not. Always look at the terms of a negotiation as they exist at any point and think, disregarding all the time and the money we've poured into this up to now, should we go ahead? Never be reluctant to pull the plug if it doesn't make any sense anymore. It's much cheaper to write off your investment than it is to plow ahead with a deal that isn't right for you just because you have so much invested in it. That's one of the things that makes Donald Trump such a powerful negotiator. He's not afraid to pull the plug on a deal that no longer makes sense. He spent $100 million to acquire the site for Television City on the west side of Manhattan. He spent millions more designing plans for the project that would include a 150-story tower, the world's tallest, and a magnificent television studio to which he hoped to attract NBC. However, when he couldn't negotiate the right tax concessions from the city, he shelved the entire project. You have to look at a negotiation in the same way. Forget what you've already invested and examine it if it still looks good the way things stand at the moment. Let's review the key points about time pressure. Under time pressure, people become more flexible. Don't let the other side know that you have a deadline. Remember the Pareto principle. 80% of the concessions are in the last 20% of the time. Tie up all the details up front. Don't leave anything to "we can work that out later." Avoid time pressure unless you have options. Options give you power, and unless you have the options, you should avoid time pressure. The longer the negotiation, the easier it is to get concessions. Be patient, but be careful that you're not making concessions because you've got time in on the negotiation. Don't throw good time and money after bad. The second pressure point is information power. The side that has the most information can often dominate the other side. Why do countries send spies into other countries? Why do professional football teams study the replays of their opponents' games? Because knowledge is power. And the more knowledge one side is able to accumulate about the other, the better chance there is for victory. If two salespeople are vying for an account, the salesperson who knows more about the company and its people stands a better chance of making the sale. Despite the obvious importance of information in a negotiation, few people spend much time analyzing the other side before starting a negotiation. Even people who wouldn't dream of skiing or scuba diving without taking lessons will jump into a negotiation that could cost them thousands of dollars without spending adequate time gathering the information they should have. Rule 1 about gathering information is don't be afraid to admit that you don't know. In my all-day and two-day seminars, I have the students break up into teams of negotiators, with some assigned as buyers and the others as sellers. I give them enough information to complete a successful negotiation. In fact, I purposely give each side discoverable strengths and weaknesses. I tell each side that if they're asked a question to which they've been given an answer, they may not lie. If they only unearth half of these carefully planted tidbits of information, they would be in a powerful position to complete a successful negotiation. Unfortunately, no matter how many times I drill the students on the importance of gathering information, even to the point of assigning 10 minutes of the negotiation for only that, they are still reluctant to do a thorough job. Why are people reluctant to gather information? Because to find things out, you have to admit that you don't know. And most of us are extraordinarily reluctant to admit that we don't know. Let me give you a quick exercise to prove this point. I'm going to ask you 6 questions, all of which you could answer with a number, but instead of having you try to guess the right number, I'll make it easier for you by asking you for a range. So if I asked you how many states there are, instead of saying 50, you'd say between 49 and 51. If I asked you how many miles is it from Los Angeles to New York, you might be less sure, so you'd say between 2,000 and 4,000. You could say from 1 to a million and be 100% sure, of course, but I want you to be 90% sure that the answer falls within the range you give. Remember to answer with a range rather than trying to guess the right number. Do you have the idea? Here are the questions. 1. How many counties are there in the United States? Don't forget to answer with a range. 2. How many wives did Brigham Young have? 3. How much did we pay Spain for Florida in 1819? 4. How many Perry Mason novels did Earl Stanley Gardner write? 5. How many head of cattle are there in the United States? 6. What is the length of Noah's Ark in feet according to Genesis? Here are the answers. 1. There are 3,042 counties in the United States. 2. Brigham Young, the Mormon leader, had 27 wives. 3. We paid $5 million for Florida. 4. Earl Stanley Gardner wrote 75 Perry Mason novels. 5. There are just over 99 million head of cattle in the United States. 6. Noah's Ark was 450 feet long. According to Genesis 6:15, the ark was 300 cubits long, and a cubit equals 18 inches. Note that all the questions were obscure. There wasn't a reason in the world for you to know the answer to any of them. By rights, you should have heard the questions and thought, this is ridiculous, I have no idea. However, you probably went ahead and answered them anyway, because we hate to admit that we don't know. So how did you do? Did you get them all right? Probably not, but think how easy it would have been for you to get them all right. All you would have had to do is to admit that you didn't know and make the range of your answer huge. You probably didn't do that because just like everyone else, you don't like to admit that you don't know. So the first rule for gathering information is don't be overconfident. Admit that you don't know and admit that anything you do know may be wrong. Rule 2 is don't be afraid to ask the question. I used to be afraid to ask questions for fear that it would upset the other person. I was one of those people who would say, would you mind if I asked you, or would you be embarrassed to tell me? I don't do that anymore. I ask them, how much money did you make last year? If they don't want to tell you, they won't. However, even if they don't answer the question, you'll still be gathering information. Just before General Schwarzkopf sent our troops into Kuwait, Sam Donaldson asked him, General, when are you going to start the land war? Now, did he really think that the general was going to say, Sam, I kind of promised the president that I wouldn't tell any one of the 500 reporters that keep asking me that question, but since you asked, I'll tell you, at 2 a.m. on Tuesday, we're going in. Of course, Schwarzkopf wasn't going to answer that question, but a good reporter asked the question anyway. It might put pressure on the other person or annoy them so that they blurt something out that they didn't intend to. Just judging the other person's reaction to the question might tell you a great deal. As I travel around the country, I'm always looking for bargains in real estate. Several years ago, I was in Tampa and noticed a for sale by owner classified advertisement that offered a waterfront home on an acre of land for $120,000. To someone who lives in Southern California as I do, it seemed like an incredible bargain. If you could find an acre of waterfront land here, it would sell for many millions. So I called up the owner to get more information. He described the property and it sounded even better. Then I said, how long have you owned it? That's a normal question that very few people would have trouble asking. He told me that he'd owned it for 3 years. Then I asked, how much did you pay for it? That's a question that many people would have trouble asking because they might think it would upset the other person and make them angry. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally he responded, well, all right, I'll tell you, I paid $85,000. Immediately I knew that this wasn't the great deal that it appeared to be. It had been a very flat real estate market in Tampa, and he hadn't improved the property. So I learned a great deal from asking that one question. However, what if he had refused to answer the question? If he told me that it wasn't any of my business what he paid for it, would I still have been gathering information? Of course I would. What if he'd have lied to me? What if he'd have said, let's see, what did I pay for it? Oh, yeah, we paid $200,000. We were really losing money. If he'd have lied to me like that, I would still be gathering information. Of course. So don't be afraid to ask the question. Telling you that one way to get information is to ask may seem incredibly simplistic to you. But all too often, salespeople don't ask because they're afraid to, or because they think they know the answer already. I once spoke at a banquet for a large packaging company and sat at dinner between a sales manager and the vice president of a food manufacturing company who was the packaging company's largest customer. I was curious to know how much of the food company's business went to this packaging company. So I leaned over to the sales manager of the packaging company and asked, how much of their business does this company give you? He told me, we don't know. They would never reveal that, but we do know they like to spread their business around. A little later, I leaned over to the vice president of the food company and asked, how much of your packaging business do you give this company? He said, 27.8%. Surprised that he had told me, I said, I suppose you like to spread your business around? He replied, well, we used to feel that way. But now if we find a supplier that will get into bed with us, we'll give them all of our business. Here was valuable information that the man on my left would have loved to have known, but he had never asked because he didn't think the man on my right would answer. What does this tell you? Ask, even if you don't think they'll answer, and even if you think you know the answer. Ask. Rule 3 tells you that where you do the asking can make a big difference. If you meet with the buyer at his corporate headquarters, surrounded by his trappings of power and authority, it's the least likely place for you to get information. People in their work environment are always surrounded by invisible chains of protocol, what they feel they should be talking about and what they feel they shouldn't. When people are in their work environment, they're cautious about sharing information. Get them away from their work environment and information flows more freely. I'm sure you agree that if you could get the buyer out to dinner or playing golf, he'd tell you all kinds of things that he wouldn't tell you in his office. Fortunately, it doesn't take that much. Sometimes all that it takes is to get that buyer down the hall to their company lunchroom for a cup of coffee. Often that's all it takes to relax the tensions of the negotiation and get information flowing. Apart from directly asking the buyer, how else can you gather information about his company? Well, one thing you can do is ask people who have done business with him already. I think you'll be amazed, even if you thought of them as competition, how much they're willing to share with you. So find out who else they do business with and call that salesperson. Another great idea is to ask people further down the corporate ladder than the person with whom you plan to deal. Let's say that you're going to be negotiating with someone at the main office of a chain of computer warehouse stores. You might call up one of their branch offices and get an appointment to stop by and see the local manager. Do some preliminary negotiating with that person. He'll tell you a lot, even though he can't actually negotiate the deal, about how the company makes a decision, why they select one vendor over another, the specification factors they consider, the profit margins they expect, the way they normally pay, and so on. Be sure that you're reading between the lines in that kind of conversation. Without knowing it, the negotiation may have already begun. For example, the branch manager may tell you they never work with less than 20% profit margins, when that may not be the case at all. And never tell the branch manager anything you wouldn't want him to tell the people at his head office. Take the precaution of assuming anything you say will get back to them. Rule 4 for gathering information is to go through peer groups, because people have a natural tendency to share information with their peers. At a cocktail party, you'll find attorneys talking about their cases to other attorneys when they wouldn't consider it ethical to share that information with anyone outside of their industry. Doctors will talk about their patients to other doctors, but not outside their profession. Power negotiators know how to use this phenomenon because it applies to all occupations, not just in the professions. Engineers, controllers, foremen, and truck drivers all have allegiances to their occupations as well as their employers. Put them together with each other and information will flow that you couldn't get in any other way. You can take an engineer from your company with you and let your engineer mix with their engineers. You'll find out that unlike top management, the level at which you may be negotiating, engineers will have a common bond that spreads throughout their profession, rather than just a vertical loyalty to the company for which they currently work. So all kinds of information will pass between these two. Naturally, you have to watch out that your person doesn't give away information that could be damaging to you. So be sure you pick the right person. Caution them carefully on what you're willing to tell the other side and what you're not willing to tell. Your open agenda and your hidden agenda. Then let him go to it trying to gather information. Peer group information gathering is very effective. Let's review the key points about gathering information. 1. Don't be afraid to admit that you don't know. 2. Don't be afraid to ask tough questions. 3. Get the buyer away from their work environment and information flows more freely. 4. Use their peer group to gather information. The last of the 3 pressure points is the most powerful. It's projecting to the buyer that you will walk away from the negotiations if you can't get what you want. In fact, if there's one thing that I can press upon you that would make you a 10 times better negotiator, it's this. Learn to develop walkaway power. The danger is that there's a mental point that you pass when you will no longer walk away. There's a point you reach in the negotiations when you start thinking, I'm going to make this sale. I'm going to get the best price and the best terms I possibly can, but I have to nail this one down. The minute you pass the point when you're willing to say, I'm prepared to walk away from this, you lose in the negotiations. So be sure that you don't pass that point. There's no such thing as a sale that you have to make at any price. And the minute you pass the point when you think there is, you've lost in the negotiations. At seminars, when a salesperson comes up to me and tells me that they made a mistake in negotiations, this is always part of the problem. They passed the point where they were prepared to walk away. Somewhere down the line in relating the story, they'll say to me, I made up my mind that I was going to get it. And I know that was the turning point in the negotiations. It was the point at which they lost. Many years ago, my daughter bought her first car. She went down to the dealer and test drove a really fine used car. She fell in love with the car, and they knew it. Then she came back, and she wanted me to go back down with her to renegotiate a better price. Tough situation, right? On the way down there, I said, Julia, are you prepared to come home tonight without the car? And she said, no, I'm not. I want it. So I told her, Julia, you might as well get your checkbook out and give them what they're asking, because you've already set yourself up to lose in the negotiations. We've got to be prepared to walk away. We walked out of the showroom twice in the 2 hours that we spent negotiating and bought the car for $2,000 less than she would have paid for it. How much money was she making while she was negotiating? Bearing in mind that I waived my normal fee. She was making $1,000 an hour. We'd all go to work for $1,000 an hour, wouldn't we? You can't make money faster than you can when you're negotiating. So you become a power negotiator when you learn to project to the other side that you will walk away from the job if you can't get what you want. Be sure that you've built enough desire before you threaten to walk away. Obviously, if they don't particularly want your product or service yet, and you threaten to walk away, you're going to find yourself standing on the sidewalk saying, what happened? You should consider selling as a 4-step process. 1, prospecting, looking for people who want to do business with you. 2, qualifying, can they afford to do business with you? 3, desire building, making them want your product or service above everybody else. And 4, closing, getting the decision. Walking away is a stage 4 gambit. You use it after you've built desire and you're going for the decision. Please remember that the objective is to get what you want by threatening to walk away. The objective is not to walk away. Don't you be calling me and saying, Roger, you'd be so proud of me. I just walked away from $1 million sale. It's like General Patton saying to his troops, keep the objective clear. The objective is not for you to die for your country. It's for you to get the other side to die for their country. In a heavy situation where there's a big sale at stake, don't threaten to walk away without the protection of good guy, bad guy. Don't do it alone. You should have a good guy left behind. Then if you threaten to walk away and they don't say, hey, wait a minute, where are you going? Come on back. We can still put this together. If they don't say that, then you still have a good guy left behind. You can say, look, he's just upset right now. I think we can still put this together if you can be a little bit more flexible in your pricing. Power negotiators know that learning to subtly communicate to the other side that you're prepared to walk away is the most powerful pressure point of them all. So in this session, I've told you about 3 pressure points that always affect the outcome of any negotiation. The person who is under the least time pressure will usually do best in the negotiation. And the person who has the most information will probably do best. And the person who is prepared to walk away has the control. In our next session, I'll teach you 2 powerful negotiating gambits that will give you a great deal of power over your buyers: higher authority and good guy, bad guy. You won't want to miss that, so I look forward to seeing you again then. This is Roger Dawson. Thank you for choosing to become a power negotiator. This is Roger Dawson. Welcome to the 10th in a series of 12 programs that will turn you into a power negotiator and teach you to make more sales at higher prices than you ever thought possible. In our last session together, I taught you about 3 pressure points that always affect the outcome of any negotiation. I taught you that when you're under time pressure, you're vulnerable, and that the person with the most information will probably do best, and that the side that is prepared to walk away has control. In this session, I'll teach you 2 powerful negotiating gambits that will give you a great deal of control over your buyers. They are higher authority and good guy, bad guy. First, higher authority. You would think that if you were going out on a sales call, that you'd be ahead to have the authority to make the decision in the negotiations. I know what I'm doing, you tell your sales manager. Let me just negotiate the best deal that I can. In reality, you put yourself in a weakened negotiating position when you do that. You're better off not to have the authority. If you do, don't let the other side know about it. Conversely, you probably get very frustrated by the buyer who claims that he or she doesn't have the authority to make a final decision. Unless you realize that this is simply a negotiating tactic that's being used on you, you feel that you'll never get to talk to the real decision maker. When I was president of the real estate company in California, I used to have salespeople coming into me all the time to sell me things: advertising, photocopy machines, computer equipment, and so on. I would always negotiate the very lowest price that I could using all of these gambits. Then I would say to them, "This looks fine. I do just have to run it by my board of directors, but I'll get back to you tomorrow with the final okay." The next day I could get back to them and say, "Wow, are they tough to deal with right now? I felt sure that I could sell it to them, but they just won't go along with it unless you can shave another couple of $100 off the price," and I would get it. I really didn't need the board of directors to approve it, and it never occurred to me that this deception was underhanded. I and the buyers with whom you deal see it as well within the rules by which one plays the game of negotiating. So when the buyer says to you that they have to take it to the committee, that may not be true, but it's an effective negotiating tactic for them to use on you. So let's first look at why you should use this gambit, and then I'll tell you how to handle it when the buyer uses it on you. Power negotiators know that you put yourself in a weakened negotiating position when you let the other side know that you can make a decision in the negotiation. You should always have to check with a higher authority before you can change your proposal or make a decision. Any negotiator who presents himself as a decision maker has put himself at a severe bargaining disadvantage. You have to put your ego on the back burner to do this, but you'll find it very effective. The reason that this works so well is simple. When the buyer knows that you have the final authority to make the deal, he knows that he only has to convince you. If you're the final authority, he doesn't have to work as hard to give you the benefits of his proposal, because once you've given your approval, he knows that he has consummated the deal. Not so if you're telling him that you have to answer to a higher authority. Whether you have to get approval from region, head office, management, partners, or board of directors, the buyer has to do more to convince you. He must make a proposal that you can take to your higher authority and get approved. Also, he knows that he must completely win you over so that you'll want to persuade your higher authority to agree to his proposal. Higher authority works much better for you when your higher authority is a vague entity, such as a committee or a board of directors. For example, have you ever actually met a loan committee at a bank? I never have. Bankers at my seminars have consistently told me that for loans of $500,000 or less, somebody at that bank can make a decision without having to go to a loan committee. However, the loan officer knows that if he or she said to you, your package is on the president's desk, you'd say, well, let's go talk to the president right now. Let's get it resolved. But you can't do that with the vague entity. So if you use the higher authority gambit, be sure that your higher authority is a vague entity, such as a marketing committee or simply the people back at head office. If you tell the buyer that your sales manager would have to approve it, what's the first thought that the buyer's going to have? Right. Then why am I wasting time talking to you? If your sales manager is the only one who can make a decision, get your sales manager down here. However, when your higher authority is a vague entity, they appear to be unapproachable. In all the years that I told salespeople that I had to run it by my board of directors, I only once had a salesperson say to me, when does your board of directors meet? When can I make a presentation to them? At this point, you may be thinking, Roger, I can't use this. I own a small company that manufactures patio furniture, and everybody knows that I own it. They know that I don't have anybody above me with whom I have to check. Sure, you can use it. I own my own company too, but there are decisions that I won't make unless I've checked with the people to whom I've delegated that area of responsibility. If somebody asks me about doing a seminar for their company, I'll say, sounds good to me, but I have to check with my marketing people first. Fair enough? So if you own your own company, your higher authority becomes the people in your organization to whom you've delegated authority. Buyers love to use the higher authority gambit on you because it gives them power without confrontation. How can you get angry with the buyer when it's the committee that is so hard to deal with? Fortunately, power negotiators know how to handle this challenge smoothly and effectively. Let me give you the counter gambits to higher authority. Your first approach should be to try to remove the buyer's resort to higher authority before the negotiations even start, by getting them to admit that they could make a decision if the proposal was irresistible. The last thing you want is to take your proposal to the buyer and have him say to you, well, that's fine. Thanks for bringing me the proposal. I'll talk to our committee or our attorney or the owners about it. And if your proposal interests us, we'll get back to you. Where do you go from there? If you're smart enough to counter higher authority before you start, you can remove yourself from that dangerous situation. So before you present your proposal to the buyer, before you even get it out of your briefcase, you should casually say, I don't mean to put any pressure on you. This, in terms of hidden meanings in conversation, is called a preparer. You've just prepared them for pressure. You've just given yourself permission to pressure on them. I don't mean to put pressure on you, but if we're going to go ahead on this, we need to get it going right away. So let me ask you this. If this proposal meets all of your needs, now that's as broad as any statement can be, isn't it? If this proposal meets all of your needs, is there any reason why you wouldn't give me a decision today? It's a fairly harmless thing for the other person to agree to, because the other side is thinking, if it meets all of my needs, no problem. There's loads of wriggle room there. However, look at what you've accomplished. If you can get them to respond with, well, sure, if it meets all of my needs, I'll give you an okay right now. Look at what you've accomplished. One, you've eliminated their right to tell you that they want to think it over. If they say that, you say, well, let me go over it one more time. There must be something I didn't cover clearly enough, because you did indicate to me earlier that you were willing to make a decision. Two, you've eliminated their right to refer it to a higher authority. You've eliminated their right to say, I want our specifications department to see it, or the purchasing committee to take a look at it. But what if you're not able to remove their resort to higher authority? I'm sure there are many situations when you'll say that to a buyer, and they'll come right out and say to you, I'm sorry, but on a purchase of this size, everything has to get approved by the specifications committee. I'll have to refer it to them for a final decision. Here are the 3 steps that power negotiators take when they're not able to remove the buyer's resort to higher authority. Step number 1, appeal to their ego. With a smile on your face, you say, but they always follow your recommendations, don't they? With some personality styles, that's such an appeal to their ego that they'll say, well, I guess you're right. If I like it, then you can count on it. But more often than not, they'll say, well, yes, they normally follow my recommendations, but I can't give you a decision until I've taken it to the committee. If you realize that you're dealing with an egotistical buyer, try preempting their resort to higher authority early in your presentation by saying, do you think that if you took this to your supervisor, he'd approve it? Often an ego-driven buyer will make the mistake of proudly telling you that they don't have to get anybody's approval. The second step is to get their commitment that they'll take it to the committee with a positive recommendation. So you say, but you will recommend it to them, won't you? Hopefully they'll reply, well, yes, it looks like a good proposal to me. I'll go to bat for you with them. So in stage 2, power negotiators get the buyer's commitment that they will go to the higher authority with a positive recommendation. There are only 2 things that can happen at this point. Either they'll say yes, they will recommend it to them, or they'll say no, they won't, because. Either way, you've won. Their endorsement would be preferable, of course, but anytime you can draw out an objection, you should say hallelujah, because objections are buying signals. That buyer is not going to object to your price unless he's interested in buying from you. If they're not interested in buying from you, they don't care how much you're charging. For a while, I dated a woman whose hobby was interior decorating. One day she was all excited and dragged me down to the Orange County Design Center to show me a couch covered in kid skin. The leather was as soft and as supple as anything I'd ever felt. As I sat there, she said, "Isn't that a wonderful couch?" I said, "No question about it. This is a wonderful couch." She said, "And it's only $12,000. I said, "Isn't that amazing? How can they do it for only $12,000? She said, "You don't have a problem with the price?" I told her I don't have a problem with the price at all. Now, why didn't I have a problem with the price? Right, because I had absolutely no intention of paying $12,000 for a couch. I don't care what they covered it with. But let me ask you this. If buying the couch interested me, would I have a problem with the price? Oh, you better believe I'd have a problem with the price. Objections are buying signals. We knew in real estate that if we were showing property and the people were oohing and ahhing all over the place, if they loved everything about the property, they weren't going to buy. The serious buyers were the ones who were saying, well, the kitchen's not as big as we'd like. Hate that wallpaper. We'd probably end up knocking out that wall. Those were the ones who would buy. Think about it. Have you ever in your life made a big sale where the buyer loved your price up front? Of course not. All serious buyers complain about the price. Your biggest problem is not an objection, it's indifference. I would rather they said to you, I wouldn't buy widgets from your company if you were the last widget vendor in the world because, than have them say to you, I've been using the same sauce on widgets for 10 years and he does fine. I don't want to take the time to talk about making a change. Indifference is your problem, not objections. Let me prove this to you. Give me the opposite of a word. If I say day, you say night. If I say black, you say white. You have the idea? Here's the question. What's the opposite of love? If you said hate, think again. As long as they're throwing plates at you, you have something there you can work with. It's indifference that's the opposite of love. When they're saying to you, like Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind, quite frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn, that's when you know the movie is about over. Indifference is your problem, not objections. Objections are buying signals. So when you say to them, you will recommend it to them, won't you? They can either say, yes, they will, or no, they won't. Either way, you've won. Then you can move to stage 3. Stage 3 is the qualified subject to close. The subject to close is the same one that your life insurance agent uses on you when he or she says, quite frankly, I don't know if we can get this much insurance on someone of your age. It would be subject to you passing the physical anyway, so why don't we just write out the paperwork subject to you passing the physical? The life insurance agent knows that if you can fog a mirror during that physical, he or she can find somebody somewhere who will underwrite that insurance, but it doesn't sound as though you're making as big a decision as you really are. The qualified subject to close in this instance would be, let's just write out the paperwork subject to the right of your specifications committee to reject the proposal within a 24-hour period for any specifications reason. Or, let's just write out the paperwork subject to the right of your legal department to reject the proposal within a 24-hour period for any legal reason. Notice that you're not saying subject to their acceptance. That's too broad. You're saying subject to their right to decline it for a specific reason. If they're going to refer it to an attorney, it would be a legal reason. If they're going to refer it to their CPA, it would be a tax reason and so on. But try to get it nailed down to a specific reason. So the 3 steps to take if you're not able to get the buyer to waive his or her resort to a higher authority are: 1, appeal to the buyer's ego; 2, get the buyer's commitment that he'll recommend it to the higher authority; and 3, the qualified subject to clause. What's the counter to the counter gambit? What if someone was trying to remove your resort to higher authority like that? If the buyer says to you, "You do have the authority to make a decision, don't you?" you should say in so many words, "It depends on what you're asking. There's a point at which I may have to go to my marketing committee." Let's say that you're selling aluminum garden sheds to a chain of warehouse hardware centers, and they're asking you to participate in their holiday weekend mailer. Your sales manager has set aside $30,000 for this, but the buyer at the chain is asking you to commit $35,000. You should shake your head and say, "Wow, that's a lot more than I expected. I'd have to take that to the advertising committee. I'd feel comfortable giving you the go-ahead at $25,000, but anything above that, and I'd have to hold off until I can find out what the committee has to say." Without creating a confrontation, you've put the buyer in a position where he might prefer to go with the $25,000 rather than have the entire mailer on hold until you can get back to him. Notice that you've also bracketed his proposal as I taught you in session 1. Assume that you'll end up splitting the difference. Then you'll still be within budget. One more thing about the higher authority gambit. What if you've got somebody trying to force you to a decision before you're ready to make it? Let's say that a buyer is pressuring you to commit to price and terms on a shipment, but wants a decision right now. He's saying, "Harry, I love you like a brother, but I'm running a business, not a religion. Give me what I need on this one right now, or I'll have to go with your competitor." How do you handle it? Very simple. You say, "Joe, I'm happy to give you a decision. In fact, I'll give you an answer right now if you want it. But I have to tell you, if you force me to a decision now, the answer has to be no. Tomorrow, after I've had a chance to talk to my people, the answer may be yes. So why don't you wait until tomorrow and see what happens? Fair enough?" As a salesperson, being able to use and handle resort to higher authority is very critical to you when you're power negotiating. Always maintain your own resort to higher authority. Always try to remove the buyer's resort to higher authority. Here are the key points to remember about higher authority. 1, don't let the buyer know that you have the authority to make a decision. 2, your higher authority should be a vague entity, not an individual. 3, even if you own your company, you can still use this by referring down through your organization. 4, leave your ego at home when you're negotiating. Don't let the buyer trick you into admitting that you have authority. 5, attempt to get the buyer to admit that he could approve your proposal if it meets all of their needs. If that fails, go through the 3 counter gambits. A, appeal to their ego. B, get their commitment that they'll recommend it to their higher authority. And C, go to a qualified subject to clause. 6, if they're forcing you to make a decision before you're ready to do so, offer to decide, but let them know that the answer will be no unless they give you time to check with your people. Now let's talk about good guy, bad guy, which is one of the best-known negotiating gambits. I'm sure you've seen good guy, bad guy used in the old police movies. Officers bring a suspect into the police station for questioning, and the first detective to interrogate him is a rough, tough, mean-looking guy. He threatens the suspect with all kinds of things that they're going to do to him. Then he's mysteriously called away to take a phone call, and the second detective who's brought in to look after the prisoner while the first one's away is the warmest, nicest guy in the world. He sits down and makes friends with the prisoner. He gives him a cigarette and he says, "Listen, kid, it's really not as bad as all that. I've kind of taken a liking to you and I know the ropes around here. Why don't you let me see what I can do for you with them?" It's a real temptation to think that the good guy's on your side when, of course, he really isn't. Then the good guy would go ahead and close on what you would recognize as a minor point close. "All I think the detectives really need to know," he tells the prisoner, "is where did you buy the gun?" What they really want to know is where did you hide the body? But starting out with a minor point like that and then moving up from there works very well, doesn't it? It's the car salesperson who says to you, "If you did invest in this car, would you get the blue or the gray? Would you want the vinyl upholstery or the leather?" Little decisions lead up to big decisions. It's the real estate person who says, "If you did invest in this home, how would you arrange the furniture in the living room? Or which of these bedrooms would be the nursery for your new baby?" Little decisions, lead up to big decisions. Buyers work good guy, bad guy on you much more than you might believe. Look out for it anytime you find yourself dealing with two people. Chances are you'll see it being used on you in one form or another. For example, you may sell corporate health insurance plans for an HMO, and you've made an appointment to meet with the Vice President of Human Resources at a company that manufactures lawnmowers. When the secretary leads you in to meet with the Vice President, you find to your surprise that the President of the company wants to sit in and listen in on your presentation. That's negotiating 2-on-1, which is not good, but you go ahead and everything seems to be going along fine. So you feel that you have a good chance of closing the sale, until the President suddenly starts getting irritated. Eventually he says to his Vice President, "Look, I don't think these people are interested in making a serious proposal to us. I'm sorry, but I've got things to do." And then he storms out of the room. This really shakes you up if you're not used to negotiating. Then the Vice President says, "Wow," sometimes he gets that way, "but I really like the plan that you presented, and I think we can still work this out. If you could be a bit more flexible on your price, then I think we can still put it together. Tell you what, why don't you let me see what I can do for you with him?" If you don't realize what they're doing to you, you'll hear yourself saying something like, "What do you think the President would agree to?" Then it won't be long before you'll have the Vice President negotiating for you, and he or she is not even on your side. If you think I'm exaggerating on this one, consider this. Haven't you, at one time or another, said to a car salesperson, "What do you think you could get your sales manager to agree to?" As if the salesperson is on your side, not on theirs. Haven't we all at one time been buying real estate and have found the property we want to buy? So we say to the agent that has been helping us find the property, "What do you think the sellers would take?" Let me ask you something. Who is your agent working for? Who's paying them? It's not you, is it? They're working for the seller, and yet they've effectively played good guy, bad guy with us. So look out for it, because you can run into it a lot. Power negotiators use several counter gambits to good guy, bad guy. One, the first counter gambit, is simply to identify the gambit. Although there are many other ways to handle the problem, this one is so effective that it's probably the only one you need to know. Good guy, bad guy is so well known that it embarrasses people when they get caught using it. When you notice the other side using it, you should smile and say, "Oh, come on, you aren't going to play good guy, bad guy with me, are you? Come on, sit down, let's work this thing out." Usually their embarrassment will cause them to retreat from the position. Two, you could respond by creating a bad guy of your own. Tell them that you'd love to do what they want, but the people back at head office are obsessed with sticking to the program. You can always make a fictitious bad guy appear more unyielding than a bad guy who is present at the negotiation. Three, you could go over their heads to their supervisor. For example, if you're dealing with a buyer and head buyer at a distributorship, you might call the owner of the distributorship and say, "Your buyers were playing good guy, bad guy with me. You don't approve of that kind of thing, do you?" I think that you should be reluctant to go over the buyer's head, because the bad feelings it causes can create some real problems for you. Four, sometimes just letting the bad guy talk resolves the problem, especially if he's being obnoxious. Eventually his own people will get tired of hearing it and tell him to knock it off. Five, you can counter good guy, bad guy by saying to the good guy, "Look, I understand what you two are doing to me. From now on, anything that he says, I'm going to attribute to you also." So now you have two bad guys to deal with, so it diffuses the gambit. Sometimes just identifying them both in your own mind as bad guys will handle it without you having to come out and accuse them. Six, if the other side shows up with an attorney or controller who is clearly there to play bad guy, jump right in and forestall their role. Say to them, "I'm sure you're here to play the bad guy, but let's not take that approach. I'm as eager to find a solution to this situation as you are, so why don't we all take a win-win approach? Fair enough?" This really takes the wind out of their sails. This gambit is still very effective even when everybody knows what's going on. It was how Presidents Carter and Reagan got the hostages out of Iran, wasn't it? You remember that? Carter had lost the election. He was very eager to do something about the Iranian hostage situation before he left the White House, and Reagan could take credit for their release. So he started playing good guy, bad guy with the Ayatollah. He said to him, "If I were you, I'd settle this thing with me. Don't take a chance on this new team coming into office in January. My goodness, have you taken a look at these guys? The president's a former cowboy actor. The vice president is former head of the CIA. Secretary of State is Alexander Haig. These guys are crazier than Englishmen. There's no telling what they might do. Reagan, playing along with it, said, hey, if I were you, I'd settle it with Carter. He's a nice guy. You're definitely not going to like what I'll have to say about it when I get into the White House. Sure enough, we saw the hostages being released on the morning of Reagan's inauguration. Of course, the Iranians were aware of good guy, bad guy, but they didn't want to take a chance that Reagan would follow through with his threats. It demonstrated that these gambits work even when the other side knows what you're doing. In fact, when you're power negotiating with someone who understands all of these gambits, it becomes more fun. It's like playing chess with a person of equal skill rather than someone whom you can easily outsmart. So remember these key points about good guy, bad guy. 1, the buyers use good guy, bad guy on you much more than you might believe. Look out for it whenever you're negotiating with 2 or more people. 2, it's a very effective way of putting pressure on the other person without creating confrontation. 3, counter it by identifying it. It's such a well-known tactic that when you catch them using it, they get embarrassed and back off. So in this session, I've taught you 2 powerful negotiating gambits that will give you a great deal of control over your buyers: higher authority and good guy, bad guy. In our next session, I'll teach you how to become an expert at resolving problems in a negotiation. What do you do when the negotiation is deadlocked? When you have the buyer close to giving you an order but they won't quite commit, how do you force them to make a decision? I'll give you the answers to those questions when we meet again. This is Roger Dawson. Thank you for choosing to become a power negotiator. This is Roger Dawson. Welcome back to the 11th in a series of 12 programs that will turn you into a power negotiator and teach you to make more sales at higher prices than you ever thought possible. In our last session together, I taught you 2 powerful negotiating gambits that will give you a great deal of control over your buyers: higher authority and good guy, bad guy. In this session, I'll teach you how to become an expert at resolving problems in a negotiation. What do you do when the negotiation's deadlock? When you have the buyer close to giving you an order, but they won't quite commit, how do you force them to make a decision? First, let's discuss some of the things that could cause problems for you in a negotiation. If you're a big-ticket salesperson, you will frequently encounter impasses, stalemates, and deadlocks in your negotiations with buyers. Here's how I define the 3 terms. An impasse is when you disagree on a major issue and it threatens the negotiations. A stalemate is when you and the buyer are still talking, but you seem unable to make any progress toward a solution. A deadlock is when the lack of progress has frustrated both sides so much that neither you nor the buyer see any point in talking to each other anymore. First, let's discuss an impasse and how to handle it. Remember that an impasse is when you disagree on a major issue and it threatens the negotiations. It's easy for an inexperienced negotiator to confuse an impasse with a deadlock. Let me give you 4 examples. 1. The purchasing agent at the automobile manufacturer in Detroit says, you'll have to cut your price by 2% a year for the next 5 years, or we'll have to resource. You know it's impossible to do that and still make a profit, so it's easy to think that you've deadlocked when you've really only reached an impasse. 2. The buyer says to you, I'd love to do business with you, but you charge too much. I have 3 other bids here that are way below what you're asking. Your company's firm policy is that they won't let you participate in bid shopping, so it's easy to think you've deadlocked when you've really only reached an impasse. 3. They're yelling at you, I don't want to talk about it. Take the shipment back and give us credit, or the next person you hear from will be my attorney. 4. The president of a plumbing supply company pokes his cigar in your face and growls, let me tell you the facts of life, buddy boy. Your competition will give me 90 days credit, so if you won't do that, we don't have anything to talk about. You know that your company hasn't made an exception to their 30 days net rule in the 72 years they've been in business. So it's easy to think you've deadlocked when you've really only reached an impasse. All of these may sound like deadlocks to the inexperienced negotiator, but to the power negotiator, they're only impasses. There's a very easy gambit that you can use whenever you reach an impasse. It's called the set-aside gambit, and it involves getting the other side to set aside the impasse issue and discuss minor issues first. By building momentum as we resolve the minor issues, we find out that the impasse issue is far more resolvable than it appeared to be at first. The set-aside gambit is what you should use when you're talking to a buyer and they say to you, "We might be interested in talking to you, but we have to have a prototype from you by the first of the month for our annual sales meeting in New Orleans. If you can't move that quickly, let's not waste any time even talking about it." Even if it's virtually impossible for you to move that quickly, you should still use the set-aside gambit. I understand exactly how important that is to you, but let's just set that aside for a moment and talk about the other issues. Tell me about the specs on the job. Do you require us to use union labor? What kind of payment terms are we talking about? When you use the set-aside gambit, you resolve many of the little issues first to establish some momentum in the negotiation before leading up to the big issues. As I'll teach you in session 12 on win-win negotiating, don't narrow it down to just one issue, because with only one issue on the table, there has to be a winner and there has to be a loser. However, by resolving the little issues first, you create momentum that will make the big issues much easier to resolve. Inexperienced negotiators always seem to think that you need to resolve the big issues first. If we can't get together on the major things like price and terms, why waste much time talking about the little issues? Power negotiators understand the other side will become much more flexible after you've reached agreement on the small issues. So these are the key points to remember about handling an impasse. 1. Don't confuse an impasse with a deadlock. True deadlocks are very rare, so you've probably only reached an impasse. 2. Handle an impasse with the set-aside gambit. Let's just set that aside for a moment and talk about some of the other issues, may we? 3. Create momentum by resolving minor issues first, but don't narrow the negotiation down to only one issue. I'll teach you more about this in session 12 on win-win negotiating. Now let's talk about handling stalemates. Somewhere between an impasse and a deadlock, you'll sometimes encounter a stalemate. That's when both sides are still talking, but you seem unable to make any progress toward a solution. Being in a stalemate is similar to being in irons, which is a sailing expression meaning that the boat has stalled with its head into the wind. When you tack, which means to turn the boat across a headwind, you must do it with a smooth, continuous motion, or the boat will get stuck with its bow into the wind. No sailboat will sail directly into the wind, only at an angle to the wind. If you want to park a sailboat, you simply turn it into the wind and it will stay there. If you lose momentum as you tack, there's not enough crosswind to move the bow of the boat around. So if you go into irons, you must try different things to get the boat to move. You may be able to do it by waggling the tiller or the wheel, or you may have to reset the sails to change the dynamics and correct the problem. Similarly, when negotiations stall, you must change the dynamics to reestablish momentum. Here are 7 things that you can do other than lower your price. 1. Change the venue by suggesting that you continue the discussion over lunch or dinner. 2. Ease the tension by talking about their hobbies or a piece of gossip that's in the news, or by telling a funny story. 3. Explore the possibility of a change in finances, such as extended credit, a reduced deposit with the order, or restructured payments. Any of these may be enough to change the dynamics and move you out of the stall. Remember that the other side may be reluctant to raise these issues for fear of appearing to be in poor financial condition. 4. Discuss methods of sharing the risk with the other side. Taking on a commitment that may turn sour might concern them. Try suggesting that 1 year from now you'll take back any unused inventory in good condition for a 20% restocking fee. Perhaps a weasel clause in the contract that applies should the market change will assuage their fears. 5. Try changing the ambiance in the negotiating room. If the negotiations have been in a low-key cooperative drive, try moving into a competitive drive. If the negotiations have been in a competitive drive, try switching to more of a cooperative drive. I'd suggest that you watch session 7 again about the different negotiating drives and consider how you could switch the stalled negotiations from one to another. 6. Suggest a change in specifications, packaging, or shipping methods to see if this shift will make the buyers think more positively. 7. It may be possible to get them to overlook any difference of opinion, provided you agree to a method of arbitrating any dispute should it become a problem in the future. If you're team negotiating, you have a couple more options. One, change the people in the negotiating team. A favorite expression that attorneys use is, I have to be in court this afternoon, so my partner Charlie will be taking my place. The court may be a tennis court, but it's a tactful way of changing the team. Two, remove a member who may have irritated the other side. A sophisticated negotiator won't take offense at being asked to leave because he or she may have played a valuable role as a bad guy. Now it's time to alternate the pressure on the other side by making the concession of removing them from your team. When a sailboat is in irons, the skipper may know exactly how to reset the sails. However, sometimes he or she simply has to try different things to see what works. If negotiations stalemate, you have to try different things to see what will regain momentum for you. These are the key points to remember. Be aware of the difference between an impasse, a stalemate, and a deadlock. In a stalemate, both sides are still motivated to find a solution, but neither can see a way to move forward. The response to a stalemate should be to change the dynamics of the negotiation by altering one of the elements. So now I've shown you how to handle the first two levels of problems that can occur, the impasse and the stalemate. If things get any worse, you may reach a deadlock, something that occurs when the lack of progress has frustrated both sides so much that neither you nor the buyer see any point in talking to each other anymore. Deadlocks are rare in the sales profession, but if you do reach one, the only way to resolve a deadlock is to bring in a third party, someone who will act as a mediator or arbitrator. There's a major difference between an arbitrator and a mediator. In the case of an arbitrator, both sides agree before the process starts that they will abide by the decision of the arbitrator. A mediator doesn't have that kind of power. A mediator is someone brought in to facilitate a solution. He or she simply acts as a catalyst, using their skills to seek a solution that both sides will accept as reasonable. Inexperienced negotiators are reluctant to bring in a mediator because they see their inability to resolve a problem as being a failure on their part. I don't want to ask my sales manager for help because he'll think of me as a poor negotiator, is what is running through their mind. Power negotiators know that there are many reasons why a third party can resolve a problem other than that they are better negotiators. Here are some of the reasons. One, a mediator can go to both sides separately and suggest to each that they take a more reasonable position. An arbitrator can even force this by telling both sides to bring in a final solution within 24 hours, telling them that he will pick the more reasonable of the two proposals. This forces each side to be more reasonable because they each fear that the other side will present a more attractive plan. It becomes, in effect, a closed bid auction of ideas. Two, a mediator listens better to each side because he's not having to filter the information through a prejudiced position. Because he has less at stake, he may well hear something to which an opponent would be deaf. Three, a mediator can persuade better because both sides perceive him as having less to gain. As I pointed out in my Nightingale Conant program, Secrets of Power Persuasion, you lose much of your ability to persuade if the listener sees you as having something to gain. For example, a buyer will believe you much more readily if you tell him that you're not on commission. And only the most naive voter believes a politician during an election. Four, when negotiating directly, you tend to assume that if the other side floats a trial balloon, then they would be willing to agree to what they're suggesting. A mediator can go to each side and propose a solution without implying that the other side is willing to comply. Five, an arbitrator can get both sides back to the negotiating table without having to promise concessions. Whether using an arbitrator or a mediator, they can only be effective if both sides see them as reasonably neutral. Sometimes you have to go to great lengths to assure this perception. Each side may insist on a team of 3 arbitrators, so each one selects one, and those 2 have to agree on a third. They would all be members of the American Arbitration Association to assure that they adhere to the highest ethical standards. The association has strict rules for the way their members can arbitrate and still stay within the law. As a salesperson, you won't be going to that much trouble. You'll be using a mediator, not an arbitrator, and chances are that your mediator will be your sales manager or someone else from your organization. If you bring in your sales manager to resolve a dispute with a customer, what is the chance that your customer will perceive him or her as neutral? Somewhere between 0 and 0, right? So your sales manager must do something to create a feeling of neutrality in the buyer's mind. The way to do this is for your sales manager to make a small concession to the other side early in the mediation process. Your sales manager comes in and, even if he's fully aware of the problem, says, "I haven't really had a chance to get into this yet. Why don't you both explain your position and let me see if I can come up with a solution that you can both live with." This terminology is important here. By asking both sides to explain their positions, he's projecting that he comes to the process without prejudice. Also note that he's avoiding the use of we when he refers to you. Having patiently heard both sides out, he should then turn to you and say, "Are we being fair pushing that? Perhaps you could give a little on the terms or some other detail. Could you live with 60 days? Don't feel that your sales manager is failing to support you. What he's trying to do is position himself as neutral in the customer's eyes. So, anytime you reach a deadlock in the negotiations, bring in a third party who's perceived as reasonably neutral by the other parties. Don't assume that you must avoid impasses, stalemates, and deadlocks at all costs. An experienced negotiator can use them as tools to pressure the other side. Once your mindset is that a deadlock is unthinkable, it means that you're no longer prepared to walk away, and you have surrendered your most powerful pressure point, as I told you in the last session. So remember these key points about handling deadlocks. 1. The only way to resolve a true deadlock is by bringing in a third party. 2. The third party can act as a mediator or an arbitrator. Mediators can only facilitate a solution, but with an arbitrator, both sides agree up front that they will abide by the arbitrator's final decision. 3. Don't see having to bring in a third person as a failure on your part. There are many reasons why they can reach a solution that the parties to the negotiation couldn't reach alone. 4. The third party must be seen as neutral by both sides. 5. If they're not seen as neutral, they should position themselves as such by making a small concession to the other side early in the negotiation. 6. Keep an open mind about the possibility of a deadlock. You can only develop your full power as a power negotiator if you're prepared to walk away. By refusing to consider a deadlock, you're giving away a valuable pressure point. Now I'm going to teach you how you can cause the negotiations to deadlock because of the way you make concessions. If you're involved in extended negotiations over price, be careful that you don't set up a pattern in the way that you make concessions. Let's say that you sell equipment and you've gone into the negotiation with a price of $15,000, but you would go as low as $14,000 to get the order. So you have a negotiating range of $1,000. The way in which you give away that $1,000 is very critical. There are 4 errors that you should avoid when making concessions. Error number 1, equal size concessions. This means giving away your $1,000 negotiating range in 4 increments of $250. Imagine what the buyer's thinking if you do that. He or she doesn't know how far they can push you. All they know is every time they push, they get another $250. So they're going to keep on pushing. In fact, it's a mistake to make any 2 concessions of equal size. If you were the buyer and the salesperson made a $250 concession and when pushed made another $250 concession, wouldn't you bet money that the next concession will be $250 also? Error number 2, making the final concession a big one. That would be the case if you made a $600 concession followed by a $400 concession. Then you tell the buyer, "That's absolutely our bottom line. I can't give you a penny more." The buyer is thinking that you made a $600 concession followed by a $400 concession, so he's sure that he can get at least another $100 out of you. He says, "We're getting close. If you can come down another $100, we can talk." You refuse, telling him that you can't even come down another $10 because you've given him your bottom line already. By now, the buyer is really upset because he's thinking, "You just made a $400 concession, and now you won't give me another lousy $10? Why are you being so difficult?" So avoid making the last concession a big one because it creates hostility. Error number 3, giving it all away up front. Another variation of the pattern is to give the entire $1,000 negotiating range away in one concession. When I set this up as a workshop at my seminars, it's amazing to me how many participants will turn to the person with whom they're to negotiate and say, well, I'll tell you what he told me. Such naivety is charming, I suppose, but it's a disastrous way to negotiate. I call it unilateral disarmament. It's what the unilateral disarmament people would have us do about nuclear arms. Dismantle all our nuclear weapons and hope that the Russians, Ukrainians, and North Koreans will reciprocate. I don't think that's very smart. So you're thinking, how on earth would a buyer be able to get me to do a stupid thing like that? It's easy. They call you up and say, you're one of the 3 vendors that we're considering. You're way high right now, but we thought that the fairest way to do this would be to ask all 3 of you for a last and final bid. Unless you're a skilled negotiator, you'll panic and cut your price to the bone, even though they haven't given you any assurance that there won't be another round of bidding later. Another way that the buyer can get you to give away your entire negotiating range up front is with the "we don't like to negotiate" ploy. With a look of pained sincerity on his face, the buyer says, "Let me tell you about the way we do business here. Back in 1926, when we first started the company, our founder said, let's treat our vendors well. Let's not negotiate prices with them. Have them quote their lowest price and then tell them whether we'll accept it or not. So that's the way we've always done it. Just give me your lowest price and I'll give you a yes or a no because we don't like to negotiate here." The buyer is lying to you. He loves to negotiate. That is negotiating. Seeing if you can get the other side to make all of their concessions to you before the negotiating even starts. Error number 4, giving a small concession up front to test the waters. We're all tempted to give a small concession first and see what happens. So initially you tell the buyer, well, I might be able to squeeze another $100 off the price, but that's about our limit. If they reject that, you might think, oh, this isn't going to be as easy as I thought, so you offer another $200. That still doesn't get you the order, so in the next round you give away another $300, and then you have $400 left in your negotiating range, so you give them the whole thing. You see what you've done there? You started with a small concession and built up to a larger concession. You'll never reach agreement doing that, because every time they ask you for a concession, it just gets better and better for them. So all of these are wrong because they create a pattern of expectations in the buyer's mind. The best way to make concessions is to offer a reasonable concession up front that might just cinch the deal. Maybe $500 concession wouldn't be out of line, half of your negotiating range. Then be sure that if you have to make any future concessions, they're smaller and smaller. Your next concession might be $200, then $100, and then $50. By reducing the size of the concessions that you're making, you convince the buyer that he has pushed you about as far as you can be pushed. If you want to test how effective this can be, try it on your children. Wait until the next time they come to you for money for a school outing. They ask you for $100. You say, no way. Do you realize when I was your age, my weekly allowance was 50 cents? Out of that, I had to buy my own shoes and walk 10 miles to school in the snow, uphill both ways. So I would take my shoes off and walk barefoot to save money. And other stories that parents the world over tell their children. No way am I going to give you $100. I'll give you $50 and that's it. I can't do it on $50, your child protests in horror. Now you have established a negotiating range. They're asking for $100 and you're offering $50. The negotiations progress at a frenzied pace and you move up to $60, and then $65, and finally $67.50. By the time you've reached $67.50, you don't have to tell them that they're not going to do any better. By tapering down your concessions, you have subliminally communicated that they're not going to do any better. However, power negotiators know how to do even better than that. Power negotiators know how to take away a concession that they have already offered the buyer. And I'll tell you how to do that next. So these are the key points to remember about concession patterns. 1, the way that you make concessions can create a pattern of expectations in the buyer's mind. 2, don't make equal-sized concessions because they'll keep on pushing. 3, don't make your last concession a big one because it creates hostility. 4, never concede your entire negotiating range just because the buyer calls for your last and final proposal or claims that he or she doesn't like to negotiate. Taper down the concessions to communicate that they're getting the best possible deal. The positioning for easy acceptance gambit is very important, particularly if you're dealing with a